and civil liberty. What he gains is civil liberty and the proprietary ownership of all he possesses. So notice you can have possessions and you can have proprietary ownership. And this proprietary ownership is somehow more legitimate, more morally acceptable than mere possession or mere acquisition. So whereas Locke thinks pre-state, pre-contract, you can legitimately acquire government, or you can legitimately acquire property, what Rousseau is saying here is that no, property is ratified and legitimized by the government or by the social contract, which makes what you have secure and legitimate because it's now vindicated by the general will. Now it's basically decreed by the sovereign that you get to hold what you have. So it's necessary to draw a careful distinction between natural liberty, which is limited solely by the force of the individual involved. So this is doing whatever you want. Civil liberty, which is being able to do whatever you want within the confines of the general will. And moral liberty, which is the most important one. And this is what we gain. This is the most important thing we gain through the creation of the general will. And this is obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself. What moral thinker, for those of you who have studied moral philosophy, does this remind us of? What great moral theorist talks about freedom and all of morality as prescribing laws to oneself? Immanuel Kant. This is Immanuel Kant's fundamental idea of morality. And guess what? He took it from Rousseau. Immanuel Kant called Rousseau the Newton of moral theory, which is a gross exaggeration. But I think Kant was probably the Newton of moral theory. And Rousseau was like, I don't know, the Tycho Brahe or something. Maybe the Copernicus. Actually, Kant thought of himself as the Copernicus in a way. I don't know. But basically, the deepest idea, one of the deepest ideas of Kant is in Rousseau. But it's also in Plato if you go back far enough. So, who really started it? I don't know. All right, and then he distinguishes possession, which is just first occupancy. Yeah, Luke.
So how exactly is moral liberty and civil liberty different if the general will is made up of everyone else's will?
Good. So civil liberty might be driven by impulses, might be driven by instincts, but it's limited by the laws. So you're free within a certain set of constraints determined by the general will. And that's civil liberty. The fact that I can go to the store and buy peanut butter is an exercise of my civil liberty, but it may not be an exercise of my moral liberty. Well, that's a bad example. I guess you can think of civil liberty as blameless liberty. So what you're permitted to do within the confines of the general will, and moral liberty is a positive fulfillment of the duties imposed by the general will. So if the general will says you have to go fight in the war or something, you're drafted, it would be an exercise of moral liberty to go and fight in that war, even though you don't want to. Rousseau did believe in the draft. But it would not be an exercise of civil liberty to refuse to go to the war, or to go to the war, because you're not free to do the former within the confines of the general will, and the latter is not a freedom, but sort of an imposition of the general will. So it's sort of like, civil liberty is what's left once you include the constraints of the general will, and moral liberty is an active fulfillment of the requirements of the general will. Civic engagement and all that. All right, possession is just amoral. It's just acquisition, physically. But proprietary ownership is based on a positive title that's handed to you by the sovereign. So property in Rousseau gets legitimized through the body politic. Okay. So we can add more things. We can add a fourth thing. The general will enables civil liberty by providing normative principles as a substitute for mere inclination and by legitimizing property. This kind of freedom is consistent with force. One can be forced to be free. I don't like how I said that. Rather say moral liberty. Oops, okay. Well. That would be perfect. This is how one can be forced to be free now. Yeah, sure.
I thought God's moral liberty was driven by impulses or emotions. Like, if you were to help someone, you would help them in accordance with your duty, not as, oh yes, this is giving me a nice feeling to help this person. So, how come inclinations?
So the moral liberty, what we're doing is we're substituting a normative principle for mere inclination. So rather than being driven by mere inclination, we're being driven by a moral principle.
So in civil liberty, you could still be driven by impulses.
Yeah. Civil liberty, as long as you're keeping those impulses within a set of legitimate constraints. And those legitimate constraints are set by the general will. Yeah. The moral liberty is the richer, more Kantian idea of being motivated by normative principles rather than inclination. Good question. Okay, any questions so far? Everybody on board? Zach?
Not really a question. I just feel like, well, actually, I don't know if this is necessary. I was just thinking, I feel like this isn't like even really Rousseau or Kant or even like maybe Plato's idea, like, or maybe Plato had something to do with it. But isn't this just the fundamental, like, a fundamental element of Christianity, like where Paul is always talking about how through Christ, like, you discipline yourself, and then in doing so, like, you're not following like the Mosaic law. You're following like the law of Christ and like disciplining yourself away from these passions. Like, isn't that kind of like the root
Yeah,
of
it
this?
probably has some elements in Christianity, certainly in ethics. The question is, what's the source of those? I don't know. A lot of people think that what happened is, at least with Augustine, we started interpreting the Bible in terms of Greek philosophy. So a lot of the theological ideas of Christianity can be traced back to Plato. The idea of an incorporeal soul, for example, was imported from Greek philosophy.
And Paul probably was influenced too, because
Yeah.
he was.
So the exact intellectual history there, I'm not competent to say. But yeah, I suspect you're right. I suspect there's hints of that in the Bible. And certainly in Christian theology, this is a huge idea. Especially, Augustine was a Manichaean who thought that there was like this deep division in society between good and evil, and the evil was bodily pleasures, and the good was pleasures of the spirit. And that's obviously related in some way. That's, there's a common genetic ancestor between that idea and this idea of the general will, or moral liberty. So we talked about this. We talked about this. So, getting on to sort of the implications of the general will. He says, the first and most important consequence of the principle established above is that only the general will can direct the forces of the state according to the purpose for which it was instituted, which is the common good. What's that about? Catherine or Sophia, Luke or Leah? Actually, I heard from Luke. Jeremiah?
What's the topic here? What is he talking about?
This idea of the general will, all the quotes we just covered.
So this is all sequential.
Yeah.
All right. Well, in that case, you can make an argument that the general will covers the common good.
Yes, so only the general will can direct the forces of the state according to the purposes for which it was instituted. So he's saying, first of all, the state was instituted for the common good. And how do we pursue that? Only through the general will. Why is it only through the general will that we can pursue the common good? Well, he says in number 2. For if the opposition of private interests made necessary the establishment of societies, it is the accord of these same interests that made it possible. What's going on there? for if the opposition of private interests made, yeah, Leah.
So since private interest is what like, so basically like going backwards, he says like private interest is what made societies, and society stemmed from people privatizing property. So it was those private interests that created society, but it was also the need for society came from those private interests.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, this opposition of private interests creates conflicts. So we need society to sort these things out. However, on certain points, these interests come into accord. They agree on certain basic matters. That we want to be free, that we want equal status, we want equal respect. We have an interest in limiting this endless quest for more rope to satisfy these base urges that make us miserable. And all these things come together and give us basically a set of interests that we all share. And the general will can express those interests. So it's the accord of these interests that makes society possible, because we can now be governed according to a general will. And that's why the general will, so that was an answer to the question above, which is, why is it only the general will that can pursue the common good? And that's definitionally true. Basically, the general will is just the thing that expresses the overlap of our interests. So if you have, policy and laws and rulers being determined by the overlap of these interests, it's just being determined by the general will. Number 3, it is what these different interests have in common that forms the social bond. And I'm just going to combine that with number 4. Sovereignty is merely the exercise of the general will. This one's just pretty straightforward. Oh, so much reluctance today. You guys help me out, Catherine, Sophia. Come on. Throw me a bone here.
Is it saying that kind of like the conflicts that you were talking about, and then like, and how everything's combined is what makes like society and like the bond between people and like how it works and whatnot?
Combining what makes the social bond, do you think?
People's interests?
Yeah. Boom. Nailed it. And then sovereignty is just basically saying, putting this overlap of interest into practice. Exactly. Thank you. Man, it's pulling teeth around here today, you guys.
Sorry.
No, thank you, Catherine. You actually jumped in there and helped me out. All right. So the general will is always right and always tends toward the public utility. There's often a great deal of difference between the will of all and the general will. That's a crucial sentence. Number 2 is really important. Nathan.
So he says, I forget where else, but he said that like the public might not always choose for like what it actually wants, but like what's right for it. Like what about when the public doesn't vote for what's right? Like,
So
how can the general will always be right if sometimes like the government or the people choose badly?
great question. So I want to say, right off the bat, so, okay, there's a couple things. One is that saying it's right doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. So right might be a normative concept, like it might be more like legitimate, and or justified. And it could be, he says, the general will, in one quote, he says, the general will is always right, but it's not always enlightened, meaning that it might lack sufficient information. Which means that if we actually have the general will and people are really voting on what they think is the common good, and then we're putting that together, what we're going to get is a justifiable result. Even though people might have had false information, so it might not actually be what the general will would have chosen if we had adequate information. So it can be incorrect, but still justified, morally speaking, because it was drawn from the will of everyone. It's sort of like, there's nothing illegitimate about me, going and, buying